This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Whether it's your new profession or just a lifelong passion, start your journey to website glory with Squarespace. Check out their amazing all-in-one platform through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. They say that one way to determine the impact of a person's life is by how many people attend their funeral. In the ancient world, that logic also applied to the size of your tomb. But imagine a scenario in which your tomb was so awe-inspiring, so magnificent, that it is the only thing about you that anyone remembers. Such is the story of the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, a tomb so elaborate that the word mausoleum entered our vocabulary to describe any above-ground tomb. Named one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, it towered over the landscape of southwestern Anatolia for centuries, lasting from the days of Alexander the Great all the way through the Crusades. Halicarnassus was a large city in the southwestern corner of Anatolia, the modern country of Turkey. It was the capital of the Kingdom of Caria, normally a satrapy of the Persian Empire, but in fact so far away from Babylon and Persepolis that it was virtually autonomous. The city was founded by Dorian Greek colonists, probably from the city of Argos. The city, like most of the rest of the cities on the western coast of Anatolia, was more Greek than Persian in culture, despite being part of the Persian Empire by the 5th century BCE. Unlike most of the other Greek territories, Halicarnassus remained loyal to Persia during the wars with Greece, and the city's queen Artemisia was one of King Xerxes' admirals in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, a decisive defeat for the Persian forces and the first step in the ultimate failure of the Persian invasion of Greece. 100 years later, in 377, King Mausolus took the throne of Caria following the death of his father, Hecatomnus. Mausolus' queen, also named Artemisia, was not only his wife but also his sister. It was apparently tradition for royal siblings to marry each other. For over 20 years, Mausolus and Artemisia ruled from Halicarnassus, and they made Caria one of the most important kingdoms in western Anatolia. Now, it is unknown whether the relationship the two of them had was truly incestuous, since there is no record of any children. But it is known that when her brother husband died in 353, Artemisia was overcome by grief that expressed itself in ways that could be best described as bizarre. She was said to have mixed some of Mausolus's ashes in glasses of wine each day and then drank the mixture, which was a popular subject in Renaissance artwork, including a work by Dutch master Rembrandt. To probably honor Mausolus, Artemisia also planned the construction of an elaborate tomb to hold her remains. You know, the remains that she didn't drink. Mausolus, like most rulers of the period, had probably made plans for the construction of his tomb before he died. The actual groundwork may have actually been done while he was still alive, but whatever had been done before Mausolus died was expanded exponentially by order of the grief-stricken Artemisia, who took over as queen and satrap of Caria following the death of her brother husband. No expense was to be spared. Artemisia arranged for the finest architects and sculptors from the Greek world to come to Halicarnassus to work on the tomb, which was sited on a hill that overlooked the city so that everyone who lived in Halicarnassus would see it at all times when it was finished. One of the primary designers of the tomb was Pythius of Priene, considered one of the first architects to treat his profession as an academic discipline that should have standards. The attention to detail shows in the final design of the structure, which took inspiration largely from the Nereid monuments located in the nearby city of Xanthos. The first step was to build an elevated stone platform with an internal staircase flanked by stone lions to allow access to the top. The outer walls of the platform had statues of gods and goddesses on them. On top of the platform, the marble tomb was placed, surrounded by more sculpture, including bas-reliefs of mythical battles, as well as a piece depicting Greek soldiers fighting Amazonian warrior women. Around the tomb were stone walls that formed an open-ended room called a cella that supported the roof. Around the cella was a portico with 36 marble columns, each evenly spaced around the perimeter of the rectangular structure. In between each column was a statue. Finally, the roof, which was pyramid-shaped, each layer of marble tapering away until it reached the top, which was decorated with a large statue depicting a 4-hour chariot ridden by figures representing Mausolus and Artemisia. What boggles the mind about the tomb of Mausolus is not only how beautiful the finished structure was, but also the pure number of man-hours that were necessary to make it so beautiful. On average, it took a skilled sculptor up to a year to carve a single statue out of a suitable block of marble, and there were dozens of them in and around the tomb. Just the decorations must have taken an army of artists years of time and effort to finish. The construction of the building itself was no mean feat either. The structure was an estimated 50 meters tall, so that it towered over the surrounding landscape. This height, the equivalent of a 15-story building, was far taller than most buildings of the period. The taller the building, the more difficult it is to construct, especially without the aid of modern machinery or lightweight building materials. Those stone blocks were very, very heavy. No one is really sure how long it took to build the mausoleum itself, though it must have been at least a few years. We do know that it wasn't finished yet when Artemisia died in 351 BCE, only 2 years after Mausolus. Artemisia had been busy in her 2 years as sole ruler of Caria. Some of the cities under her reign objected to being ruled by a woman, which required military intervention. She also reportedly conquered the nearby island city of Rhodes, supposedly by stealing the Rhodian navy ships from an invading armada, sailing them back to Rhodes, and then surprising the inhabitants by popping out of their own boats like a naval Trojan horse. After Artemisia's death, the throne passed to her brother Idrius, who apparently decided to continue funding the construction of the tomb, as it must have been finished during his reign, the craftsman who built it deciding that finishing the monument was as much about professional pride as it was pleasing their now dead patron. Halicarnassus and the kingdom of Caria continued to prosper for another 2 decades after the death of Mausolus, now with his and Artemisia's tomb looking down over the city. In 334 BCE, the king of Macedon, Alexander, invaded the Persian Empire, defeating the army sent to stop him in the Battle of the River Granicus. Alexander's greatest weakness was his lack of strong navy to counter the powerful Persian fleet, so he resolved to capture all of the ports on the Asian side of the Aegean Sea so that the Persian navy would have nowhere to resupply. Thus, he set his sights on Halicarnassus. When he marched into Caria, Alexander found Ada, the last living sibling of Mausolus and Artemisia, who had been living in exile after she was forced from the throne in 340. They made a deal. Alexander would put Ada back on the throne in return for her loyalty to him, as well as her declaring him heir to the throne, so that when she died, the kingdom would pass to him and his descendants. Before they could do that, though, they had to deal with the Persians. The Persian commander, Memnon of Rhodes, was laid up in Halicarnassus, forcing Alexander to lay siege to the city. This posed a problem, of course, because of his lack of navy. He was unable to prevent the Persians from resupplying by sea, so he couldn't starve the population into submission. He would have to take the city by storm. One attempt failed after Memnon deployed a relatively new invention, catapults, on Alexander's troops. Eventually, Alexander battered his way through the walls on the eastern side of the city, and his troops started pouring in. Memnon, realizing the city was lost, evacuated his troops by sea, setting fires before he went to destroy military supplies that he couldn't take with him. The fire spread, and most of Halicarnassus was consumed by flames. Practically, the only building that survived the siege was the tomb of Mausolus, which now towered over the ruins of the city, which would never really recover as Alexander marched east to everlasting fame as Alexander the Great. Alright, we'll get back to today's video in just a sec, but first, here's a word from today's sponsor, Squarespace. Look, it's very easy to get overwhelmed by the internet. There's a whole lot of complicated names and terms that people don't really understand. Web3, blockchain, SEO, the dark web, the Internet of Things. Don't let any of that intimidate you. Contrary to popular belief, you don't have to be a web engineer to start a website. You just need a good idea. And our friends at Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one toolkit that helps you transform that thing that's in your head onto the screen in front of you. Absolutely anyone can use it successfully. I know because I did, and I don't know anything about how this stuff works. If you want to heavily customize your website, Squarespace gives you the freedom to do that. You can play around with different elements, manipulate the colors, create the exact perfect website that you want. Or you could just do what I did, take one of their templates, customize it a little bit. You don't have to do any design work whatsoever. Super easy. No trouble at all. So whether you want to start a blog, a business, or something in between, you too could do it with Squarespace. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your new site, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's video. Alexander's conquests opened up a vast new world to the Greeks, a world that they were only too happy to explore, even as the Macedonian king's successors tore his empire apart among themselves. Greek travelers would visit the east, and then they would write chronicles of their adventures, listing sites they believed that other people should see. One of these was the Antipater of Sidon, a poet who lived in the 2nd century BCE. One of his great poems listed the great buildings that he'd seen in his travels: the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Colossus of Rhodes, the statue of of Zeus at Olympia, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the Great Pyramid of Giza, and the tomb of Mausolus in Halicarnassus. Eventually, the seventh one he listed, the Walls of Babylon, was replaced by the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria, and the list of 7 wonders of the world was complete. The list served as a kind of tourist guidebook for the places one should go and the things they should see, and not only for the Greeks, but the Romans too when they came along. Rome took control of Anatolia about when Antipater was puttering around there looking at things, and they were impressed by the tomb of Mausolus as well. Romans had an appreciation for fine architecture, and they were so awed by what they found in Halicarnassus that Roman patricians all wanted to build impressive above-ground tombs for themselves as well. In tribute, they called their buildings mausoleums, meaning that King Mausolus would now live on forever as the eponymous name for tomb. The mausoleum would stand for more than 1,000 years intact, even as the rest of Halicarnassus decayed around it. The town was raided by pirates several times, then flattened by earthquakes. By the start of the Byzantine period, the great city of Mausolus and Artemisia was essentially gone. Eventually, however, Mother Nature caught up to the mausoleum. No one is exactly sure when, but a series of earthquakes gradually reduced the magnificent tomb to rubble. The columns shattered, the chariot statue on top sent crashing to the ground. By the start of the 15th century CE, only the base of the mausoleum was still recognizable. In 1402, the Knights of St. John, better known as the Knights Hospitaller, showed up in southern Anatolia after being ejected from their base at Smyrna. Established during the Crusades as a Catholic order of knights to guard the Holy Land, they had since become an entity unto themselves, ruling from the island of Rhodes and surrounding territories. They were looking to build a fortress that would serve as a bulwark against the encroaching Ottoman Empire, and decided the old site of Halicarnassus would be the perfect place to set up. To build their castle, the knights used stones from the ruins of the old city, including from the remains of the mausoleum. The great stone blocks, the marble columns, even the remains of statues and sculptures were taken from the ruins and used in the construction of what the knights called the Patronium, or Castle of St. Peter, either built directly into the walls or ground down into lime for making plaster. The town that grew up around the castle became known as Bodrum, a name that it still bears today. The knights were thorough in their scavenging efforts. By the time the Patronium was finished, nothing remained of King Mausolus's once grand tomb except the foundations. The castle, meanwhile, became the second most important fortress in the knights' possession, behind only their main base of operations in Rhodes. After the capture of Constantinople in 1453, the knights were the only major Christian opposition to the Ottomans left in the eastern Mediterranean, and the Turks spent a lot of time and resources trying to get rid of them. In June 1522, a massive army led by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent landed at Rhodes and laid siege to the city. The knights defended their capital for 6 months before being forced to surrender. According to a deal reached with Suleiman, they were permitted to leave Rhodes with their weapons, banners, and honor intact. They set up a new base on the island of Malta, which they governed until 1798. With Rhodes lost, the knights' position at Bodrum became untenable, and they abandoned the castle and town to follow their comrades to Malta in 1523. Bodrum was in the possession of the Ottomans until the end of the First World War, when it became part of the Republic of Turkey. The fortress, now known as Bodrum Castle, still stands and is a museum today, containing artifacts taken from the mausoleum during the original construction and in the centuries since. In the 19th century, scholars in the emerging field of archaeology fanned out to historical sites across Europe and Asia, hoping to unearth the past rather literally. After the Roman city of Pompeii was discovered buried underground, historians figured other ancient Roman and Greek sites were out there too, and all they had to do was dig them up. In 1856, the British Museum sent one of its most eminent archaeologists, Charles Thomas Newton, to Anatolia. The British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Lord Strafford Redcliffe, had given Newton funds to see if he could find anything of the mausoleum of Halicarnassus in the city of Bodrum. The problem was, of course, that by that point it had been 450 years since anyone had seen anything of the mausoleum, so he wasn't sure where it was. He couldn't just buy all of the plots of private land in the general area either, as it quickly ran out of money. So he had to make his best guess based on reviewing the works of the ancient writers like Pliny the Elder. Then he fudged it a little. He dug a hole in the ground and then tunneled under surrounding plots of land until he found something of interest. Then he knew which plots of land he needed to buy. Initial excavations uncovered walls, a staircase, and some sculptures. Eventually, he uncovered 3 of the 4 corners of the foundation, and then the greatest prize of all, the 2 statues of Mausolus and Artemisia that had been adorned on top of the tomb alongside pieces of the roof. Bits of the chariot and horses from the sculpture were also found. Evidently, an earthquake had caused the roof to collapse, and the statue tumbled to the ground and became buried in the earth. Also discovered was most boast of a bas-relief carving depicting the fighting between Hercules and Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. All of this was taken to the British Museum, where today it's found in room 21, the Mausoleum Gallery. It was the greatest find in Charles Newton's career. For his contributions to scholarly research, he was made a Knight Commander of the Order of Bath by Queen Victoria in 1887. Also in the British Museum's collection, though not currently on display, is the jar of Xerxes I, which was found in the Mausoleum ruins by the western staircase. This jar, made of calcite, is inscribed with the four-language signature of the great King Xerxes. These jars, made in Egypt, were considered very valuable by the Persians, so the fact that the Carians had one indicates just how strongly the association between them was. It is likely this jar was given to Queen Artemisia by King Xerxes sometime either before or after he invaded Greece, making it over 100 years older than the mausoleum itself. The most extensive modern studies of the ruins were made by Danish professor Christian Jebsen of Aarhus University, conducted between 1966 and 1977. One of the most interesting things that this modern project uncovered is the existence of an ancient tunnel dug under the foundations of the mausoleum right up to the burial chamber. Apparently, some enterprising thief, long before the Knights of St. John had shown up, had snuck into the place and stolen everything of value from the burial chamber. It's too bad we'll never know anything more about those grave robbers, because it sounds like a hell of a heist story. The Mausoleum of Halicarnassus is a strange creature, all things considered. It is probably one of the most unappreciated of the Seven Wonders today, much less famous than the Colossus of Rhodes or the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, despite the fact that the mausoleum lasted much longer than either of those two structures and had arguably a bigger cultural impact and historical footprint. As we said before, the Romans in particular were inspired by the mausoleum and modelled a lot of their own tombs after it. One particularly well-preserved example is the Gurmiskersen monument in Miletus, modern-day Turkey, which dates from the 2nd century BCE. The mausoleum also had a firm footprint in modern architecture as well. Architects, especially during the Art Deco period, used the mausoleum as a basis for many buildings which still stand today. Some of the more well-known examples of buildings based on or inspired by the mausoleum include the tomb of Ulysses S. Grant in New York City, Los Angeles City Hall, the National Diet Building in Tokyo, and the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, Australia. One wonders how King Mausolus would feel if he came to life today and realized that the only thing people knew about him was the size and splendor of the tomb that his wife built for him. Although when you think about it, it's better than not being remembered at all, I suppose, or, being remembered for drinking your dead husband who is also your brother's ashes in your daily wine. Right?